Did you know there's real, written, documented proof that was never used against the McCanns? Not for lack of relevance, but due to a silent decision. Today we're going to reveal the locked dossier that the system preferred to forget. An omission that may have changed everything. Imagine an empty room, cold, quiet. At the back, a single drawer, old, heavy, as if it had been purposely forgotten. Inside, a dossier, dusty, yellowed at the edges, with the name McCann marked on the cover. It's not hidden. It never was. It's there, within anyone's reach. But nobody touches it. This image might seem symbolic, but it's more real than it appears. Because yes, there is concrete evidence in this case. An official document, registered, analyzed, and yet set aside. Not for lack of relevance, but because it was too uncomfortable. Because this evidence, if used, wouldn't just alter the course of the investigation. It would also shake an invisible pact between the media, justice, and the collective comfort that everyone, without realizing, has learned to maintain. It's as if the system had made a silent agreement. We know what's in there, but we're not going to open it. Perhaps out of fear of what might come out, or worse, because opening it would mean accepting that the truth never disappeared. It was just locked away. This story doesn't begin with a new theory. It begins with the courage to face something that has always been within reach, but no one wanted to touch it. And so I ask you, what if what has always been missing in this case wasn't another witness, another clue, another twist? What if what was missing was simply someone having the courage to open what was already there? There are pains that don't scream, they just weigh heavily. The pain of knowing something was there and was ignored. The pain of realizing that perhaps it was never about a lack of evidence, but about the decision not to use it. Those who have followed this case closely, even as spectators, know the discomfort, the feeling that there was more, but it was pushed under the table. Because touching this would put many things at risk: reputations, institutions, narratives. But there's a limit between protection and omission. And when that limit is crossed, silence ceases to be prudent and becomes complicity. Today, this dossier will be opened, not as a theory, but as a call. What's in there won't please everyone, but perhaps, finally, it will free those who have always wanted to understand. If you've ever felt something was wrong in all this silence, this video is the right place to start. In the first few days when Madeleine disappeared from room 5A in that resort in Portugal, the world stopped. The lights of the press illuminated the darkness. Authorities rushed, neighbors helped, and the eyes of millions followed, day after day, what seemed to be a story of loss, and nothing more. But behind the visible panic, something more discreet was being built. Another type of silence, one that doesn't happen by chance. The investigation began disorderly, it's true. There were errors, confusion, poorly checked leads, but there were also discoveries. One of the strongest came with the sniffer dogs, trained to detect traces of human blood and cadaver odor. They reacted in two places, in the family's apartment and in the trunk of the car rented by the McCanns weeks after the disappearance. This isn't a rumor, it's registered, official, filed. Along with this came Kate McCann's refusal to answer 48 questions asked by the Portuguese police. Direct, simple questions, many of which any mother would answer with her eyes closed. But there was no response, no plausible explanation. Even so, the case didn't advance. The evidence, the reports, the dog's reactions, the unanswered questions, everything was piled in a corner, classified as inconclusive, filed away, and the official version became, no one knows what happened. But what if they do know? What if, from the beginning, the problem was never the lack of evidence, but the risk that this evidence represented? Looking at the timeline of this case, it's not difficult to notice where decisions change direction. Every time a lead threatens to compromise the main narrator of the story, it evaporates. Every time a detail points to an uncomfortable direction, it's labeled as noise. It wasn't truth that was missing. It was the willingness to follow it through to the end. Because sometimes maintaining an incomplete story is more convenient than facing everything it really contains. The most frightening thing is realizing that this choice, not to use what was already there, wasn't an isolated error. It follows a pattern of highly sophisticated silence. You may have heard of the Dreyfus case in France. An unjustly accused officer ignored evidence, a lie sustained by patriotism and much public pressure, until someone had the courage to reopen what was already locked. And even then, the damage had already been done. In Madeleine's case, what makes us uncomfortable isn't the absence of answers. It's the feeling that someone has them and chose to keep them locked away. And so we return to that image of the drawer, of the locked dossier. It wasn't destroyed, it wasn't lost, it was simply ignored. When the dog's report was presented, experts said, this would be enough to open a case in any other situation. But not here. Here they said it was fragile, that it didn't prove enough, that it could be a mistake. And so silence became policy, silence became protection, and omission became the norm. There's something deeply disturbing about this, because it teaches us that justice, in some cases, doesn't fail due to incompetence. It fails by strategy, and in this scenario, the dossier becomes more than paper. It becomes a symbol of everything that could have been done and wasn't. And this leaves us with a question that's difficult even to pronounce. What else was set aside just because it was too convenient to forget? Perhaps the system doesn't need to lie. It just needs to choose what not to show. And when the truth depends on someone's willingness to open a drawer, then the problem isn't the lack of light, it's the fear of turning it on. There are things that don't leave your mind, even as time passes. And this evidence is one of them. It's not theory, it's not rumor, it's not free internet interpretation, it's a document, it's protocol. It's there, signed, digitized, registered. A forensic report issued after the work of 2 dogs specialized in detecting cadaver odor and biological residues. Dogs with a history of precision, used internationally in dozens of criminal investigations. They entered the apartment and reacted. Then in the trunk of the car rented by the McCanns, and they reacted again, at the same point, with the same behavior. The registered mark of death, a direct clue, a possible turning point. But this evidence never became anything. It was never used in court, it was never taken forward. The reports were filed away under the excuse that they weren't conclusive. And at that moment, it wasn't the lack of evidence that spoke louder. It was the convenience of silence. And the most disturbing thing? This wasn't done in the shadows. This happened under the spotlight, in front of the international press, with cameras on and headlines stamped. The omission happened in broad daylight, because sometimes hiding isn't burying, it's simply choosing to ignore what's there. The mother, Kate McCann, refused to answer 48 questions during the interrogation. Among them, did you see your daughter that night after putting her to bed? Swing. Did you feel guilty about anything? Zerina. Did you lie about any part of what happened that night? Silence. 48 times. No answer. This was documented, filed, and set aside. And then, the question that hurts isn't, why did they do this? The real question, the one that gets stuck in your throat, is, why didn't anyone want to use what was already there? Because one thing is not having evidence. Something quite different is deciding to pretend it doesn't serve. And here, the story changes tone. Because we're no longer talking about doubt. We're talking about choice. About a drawer that was opened, read, and closed. Not by mistake, but by decision. Can you imagine someone reading this report, seeing the dog's reaction, cross-referencing the data with the suspicious movement of the car, and deciding, better not touch this, because that's what happened. The system read the dossier and preferred the risk of silence to the discomfort of truth. And this isn't a coincidence, it's a strategy. As Hannah Arendt said, the greatest evil is that which is done in silence, with bureaucratic indifference. Here that indifference has form, the drawer, the folder, the seal that was never broken. everything inside screaming what no one had the courage to say out loud. Imagine the weight of this, knowing there was a real clue, knowing it was considered but not used, that at some point someone found it safer to maintain a stable narrative than to reopen the abyss this evidence could bring. And perhaps that's why this truth remained where it was for so long. Because touching this point doesn't just bring down a hypothesis, it brings down a pact, an implicit agreement between justice, media, public image, and collective opinion. And in this type of pact, who loses is always the truth. Now stop, breathe, think with me. If you had this evidence in your hands and knew that using it could destroy an entire family, would you use it? This is the dilemma. Not technical, not legal, but human, painful, real. Because it's not just about knowing, it's about nobody shouts. Because they know that when they fall, they make too much noise. And the cruelest thing about all this is that justice perhaps didn't fail for lack of evidence. It failed because it knew too much. And the question that won't be silenced is this: if this dossier is reopened, who do you think will want to be around? The sound of the drawer opening wasn't loud. It was dry, almost mechanical, but it echoed as if someone had set off a siren inside an empty room. That which had been silent for years was now before everyone, without noise, without a shout, without an alarm, just the paper, the signature, the date, the truth in the form of a file. The dossier was no longer just a set of pages. It was a mirror, reflecting everything that was denied, delayed, silenced. And with it exposed, no one could say any more that they didn't know. The question was no longer, does this exist? It was another, much more difficult. What do we do with this now? The impact started small. First with those who always believed something was wrong, people who watched the case from afar but never swallowed the ready-made versions. Then with the professionals who, years ago, participated in the investigations and were silenced, discredited. And finally, it reached even those who preferred not to know, because the truth, when it emerges, doesn't ask permission. It invades. There was no celebration, nor immediate indignation. What came first was silence, a heavy silence, from those who realized they pretended for too long that there was nothing there. But there was, and now there was no going back. On the faces of those who believed in the official version, the discomfort was visible. Avoided gazes, restless hands, as if the body itself knew what the mind was still trying to deny. No one said anything, but everyone felt it. It was as if the air had changed, as if something that had been trapped there for years had finally been released. And then came the reactions. A retired police officer said, almost whispering on a local radio program, "We knew, we just couldn't speak." A journalist who covered the case for a decade published an article titled, "The folder was there, I just didn't want to look." These phrases weren't complete confessions, but they weren't denials either. They were cracks. Small, yes, but enough to show that the dossier wasn't rumor. It was a bomb, and now once opened, it could no longer be diffused. This is where the spectator's role changes, because this story doesn't end with a handcuffed culprit or a final verdict. This story ends with you, with the folder open in front of you. And a question without an instruction manual: what do you do with what you've seen? This is no longer just a story about the McCann case. It's a story about systems that silence, about decisions made far from the public eye, and about what happens when someone decides to break the pact and open what should never have been locked. Now the dossier ceases to be just evidence. It becomes a mirror, and in it, we see not only the names in the process, but also the reflection of our choice to continue pretending nothing is wrong, or to accept the discomfort of knowing too much, and even so, choosing not to be silent. Because an ignored truth, when finally revealed, changes everything. Not for what it says, but for what it demands from those who listen. And if you've come this far, perhaps you already know the answer. Perhaps the most frightening thing was never what the dossier hid, but rather the time it remained closed, with no one daring to open it. Now that you've seen it, The dossier can no longer be locked. The question is no longer if there's something hidden. The question is, who will have the courage to sustain what has been revealed? Silence in this case was never the absence of evidence. It was a choice. And what's frightening isn't what they found, but what they decided not to use. Because when the system knows, but chooses not to act, it ceases to be justice. It becomes a shield to protect versions, images, narratives that comfort. This isn't a supposition. It's not theory. The evidence was there, with a date, with a record, with validity. But it was locked in a drawer, as if time could erase its strength, as if no one would ever be bold enough to open it. And now that the drawer is wide open, that eyes are before it, the discomfort is inevitable. I don't bring this to point fingers at culprits. I show you what they left behind because they knew that, if it came to light, everything would change. And it did change. You saw it. You felt it. And perhaps, like me, you have that knot in your throat, the one that comes when we realize that what was wrong was always visible, but no one wanted to see. You know what's worse? That it was accepted, it's not the omission. That it became part of the process. That silence in some cases is institutional, almost protocol, and that the truth, when inconvenient, isn't overthrown. It's put to sleep, stored in a locked dossier. But today that dossier was opened, and this in itself is already a rupture. Now that you've seen it, there's no going back. You can't unsee it, or pretend it was insignificant. Because this document doesn't just change the story of a case. It changes the way we understand power, protection, and the fear that some institutions have of light. From now on, the decision isn't just with them, it's with us. You who have followed this story to this point, know that you're no longer dealing with a mystery. You're facing an uncomfortable truth, but a necessary one. One of those that doesn't ask to be accepted, it asks to be sustained, with courage, with awareness, with presence. And although this video began with a question, it ends with a mirror. What do you do with what you know? Because the truth, however uncomfortable it may be, when revealed, becomes responsibility. If this video affected you in some way, if some part of your memory, your faith in the system, your desire for justice was touched, then you're already part of this. You're no longer just a spectator, you're a witness. And when the witness sees, they can no longer pretend they didn't see. Now, I want to know what this awakened in you. What point bothered you the most? What line stopped your breathing for a second? What part of the story kept echoing in the silence after the last sentence? Leave your perspective there. It can be just a line, but let it come from truth. Comment, I open the dossier and I don't accept the silence. And if you want to transform this truth into something more lasting, stronger than a comment, there's a gesture that carries weight. The super chat here isn't just a contribution, it's a silent signature, a way of saying, I saw, I felt, and I want this to continue. Not as a spectator, but as someone who believes that stories like this can no longer be buried for convenience. If this story moved you, the super chat is your way of saying, continue. There are stories that the world tries to forget. If you believe they need to be told, this is the time to show that you're here. Because whoever sends a super chat here isn't just supporting the channel. They're leaving a trace, a signal, a message to those who tried to hide all this. The truth has been seen, and it won't go back into the drawer. It's not just support, it's a sign that I'm not alone, that you also carry this discomfort, that we're turning the key slowly but firmly. And if this video truly touched you, if this dossier is now also yours, I'll see you in the next one. There, we'll continue opening what was never allowed to be seen. And this time, there will be no silence to prevent it. Because when the truth bleeds, the next step isn't to avoid, it's to face. The next story begins where this one ends, at the exact moment you decide not to close your eyes. Not all silence is forgetting. Sometimes, it's just the world waiting for someone to have the courage to speak. And now, you know.